On this video, I'm continuing my board game glossary series. We've already talked about types of board games. Now we're going to go into more detail into certain types of mechanics. If you are new to the board gaming hobby, then check out my previous video in the series, but also stay tuned. Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector from the Broken Meeple, and if you like what you see, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell for future notifications of all content, including live streams which get planned on an ad hoc basis. Of course, anything important from websites specifically that I describe in this video will be provided links in the description below. So this is continuing my board game glossary series of videos. Originally it was just going to be the one video, but then I found out it takes quite a long time to record these, not to mention there's a lot of terms to go through. So I decided to split this into 3 categories. The previous video, which you can check out on this channel, is more talking about board game types. So an Ameritrash game, a Euro game, a filler game, those sort of things where we're more broad with the type of game we're describing. This video is now going to go into detail into specific mechanics. Now we may use these to describe types of games as well. Sometimes they won't say it's a Euro game, they'll say it's a worker placement game. That being said, this is more about the mechanic rather than the type, because a Euro game could describe all sorts of different mechanics, whereas a worker placement game is specifically tied to that mechanic. So I had to split them into categories somehow anyway. This is not exactly the guru gospel list, shall we say, but I'm going to go through as many mechanics as I can. So without further ado, let's get cracking. First up is action point allowance. This is used quite often in a lot of games, and typically it's essentially saying that you have a certain amount of things that you can do on your turn. A game will give you a set number of points for actions, say 4 action points. And the idea is that you will have a selection of options available to you as to what to do on your turn. Moving, fighting, interacting with an object, anything in particular. But the idea is that these actions will cost a certain amount of action points. And by spending your action points, you can do whatever actions you like in any order that you like. It's giving you flexibility, but also restricting on how much you can do in a given turn. 2 very classic examples of this mechanic being used include Pandemic and Flashpoint Fire Rescue. Area control, as the name implies, is talking about controlling areas on a board. Typically this is used with a map setting where you will control different territories. Now whether that means you need the majority in a particular territory in terms of figures or power rating or whatever, it's all about getting your people on the board and getting them into specific areas and controlling as much of the board as possible. 2 very classic examples of this include Small World and the classic game Risk. Auction games function essentially like a normal auction does. Players are bidding on specific items in order to enhance their position in the game. What they're bidding on is irrelevant. It's all about taking place just like a normal real-life auction where you've seen cars being sold in antiques. It's the same principle. 2 very simple examples of auction games include Modern Art and For Sale. Now this is one you're going to hear pretty often because it's one of the more popular mechanics out there, and that is card drafting. Card drafting involves all players having a hand of cards, let's say 10 cards in their hand. You will look at these 10 cards and pick 1 card to keep, just the one. Sometimes it varies, but usually it's just 1. And you will keep it down and just leave it face down for now. You will then take all the cards that you had and pass them usually to the player on your left. It varies between game to game. The other player to your right has now just passed you a selection of cards, which you will now, after revealing the card you kept, look at the new set of cards, again, pick 1, leave it face down, pass the cards to the next player, reveal, and then take the cards from the player before you. And it goes round in a circle until eventually all the cards that were available in said round have been taken by players. And of course, you're trying to take specific cards to enhance your position, gain more resources, gain more money. It depends on the context of the game. This mechanic has been used to death in all sorts of different games. It's sounds more trickier than it actually is, and it's certainly going to be new to a lot of you, but bear with it. It's a very entertaining mechanic and not that difficult to master. 2 of the most popular drafting games that you can get include 7 Wonders and Sushi Go. Deck building games. Now this is going to be one of the more harder concepts for some of you new gamers to grasp, so bear with me. The idea is that you will start off with a selection of cards. Think of a deck of cards just like your normal Ace of Spades style cards. You start off with a fixed deck. Everybody has the same starting deck. Nothing has changed, nothing is different between the players. From this point, as the game progresses, players will acquire new cards to add to their deck from a shared pool. These cards will be available to everybody, but what cards people choose to acquire is entirely up to them based on their strategy. So whatever deck you construct by the end of the game will be fundamentally different to the other players. The art of a deck building game is trying to decide which cards to buy, which ones are going to aid you more, and in many cases trimming cards from your deck by taking them out of the deck and out of the game essentially in order to make it more efficient. This particular mechanic is usually one of the harder ones for newer players to grasp, so if you want a nice introductory level system to what deck building is, I can highly recommend Dominion along with Star Realms and Dale of Merchants. Hidden movement. If you haven't guessed it from the title, this usually involves a game where one or more players are moving around a board, but they are hidden from the other players. And usually this takes place in what's known as a one versus many format, where one person is hidden and the other players have to find out where they are and try to catch them. This could be done in all sorts of different themes, but the key concept is that that one player, or several players maybe, is noting down where they are on the board secretly, and is trying to evade the other players for whatever reason. Best examples of this include Spectre Ops as well as Fury of Dracula. Cooperative play. Now this can be a type of game as well as a mechanic. I'm choosing to put it in the mechanic category though because my next one is going to kind of, shall we say, spin off from this one. A cooperative game is where the players will work together to beat the game itself. There'll be a task at hand, a mission to complete, a certain score to reach, but the difference between this and many other games is that the players are working together. So you have a common enemy, a common objective. It may be that there's a supervillain that you have to beat up and you as the heroes must work together to beat that villain. Usually this tends to take place in survival settings where you and your friends are marooned on a desert island and you must find supplies and survive until help arrives. The themes go all over the place with cooperative games, but the key aspect is that you are all working together. Classic examples of a cooperative game include Forbidden Desert and Robinson Crusoe. Now why was I so keen to do cooperative plays a second ago? Well, that's because the next one I want to mention is Hidden Traitor. Cooperative games have you working together to beat the game itself. Hidden Traitor is a spin-off from this type of mechanic where one of you is secretly against the other players. So you all appear to be working together, but one of you wants the game to tank. It wants it to fail for whatever reason. Typically this could be that you're trying to beat an enemy and the enemy has somebody hidden within your group who's secretly working with them. Again, the themes are endless as to where this goes, and this is now becoming more and more common in many games, whether thematic or not. These traitors may not necessarily stay hidden for the entire game. It may be that the whole game is based on you trying to figure out who that hidden traitor is, but then occasionally the hidden traitor will get to reveal themselves during the game in order to enact more annoyances on the group themselves. Examples of games with hidden traitor mechanics include Shadows of a Camelot and Obscurio. Pick up and deliver games. Not as common as one might think, or maybe that's just my collection in general, but pick up and deliver involves picking up and delivering. Yeah, pretty self-explanatory. Usually it involves picking up goods, so trade goods, cloth, silk, salt, whatever you want to call it, and taking them to another point on the board. Typically the board will be a map, so it may say that I need to get some iron from San Francisco and deliver it to Miami in Florida. That will get me points, it will get me money, it will enhance my position and help me to win the game. Pretty straightforward. Examples of this include Spike as well as Wasteland Delivery Express. Press your luck. This is typically done with dice, but it can include other components as well. This usually involves you trying to acquire something or achieve something by a random element, but then the game gives you a chance to back out at any particular time. But you have the decision at that point to decide, nah, you know what, I want to go a little bit more. I want to press my luck and see if I can get a bigger reward. The greater the risk, the greater the reward. Of course, the problem is that you might fail and bust and something bad might happen to you. Again, typically done with dice. A classic example could be, I need to roll as many sixes as possible, and the more sixes I roll, the more points I get. Fine, you roll a bunch of dice. However, if you roll 3 ones, you will bust and you will lose points. So you roll all the dice and get a 6, but no 1s. Okay, I'll carry on. You roll again, you get 3 more 6s, but then you roll 2 1s. Do you continue to roll more dice and try to get more 6s, or are you worried that you might roll that 3rd 1? This is press your luck in a nutshell, and great examples of this include the Quacks of Quedlinburg and Inkengold. Role selection. Role selection involves picking a character role that you will get to use for the next round of play. Typically, this is different from player powers, where you would have a fixed character for the whole game. This is saying that each round or each phase, you will get to choose a different character, a different role, maybe a different player power, and you will use that for the current round. When the next round comes along, you get to then choose a different character, or maybe the same one again, depending on the game mechanics. And so the game is all about trying to use these different roles as and when you need them in order to make your game more efficient and better your chances of winning. Now, the characters might be in limited supply, so for example, I want the builder role this round. Well, the builder role might get taken by another player, which means I need to think of a different role to use, and so there's a bit of tension between whether a player is going to take a role before you do. Very good examples of this include Citadels and Mission Red Planet. Roll and write. This is kind of subject to some tweaks here and there. You've heard roll and write, you've heard flip and write. There's probably various forms of and write used in this term, but let's stick with roll and write for now and maybe flip and write. The idea is that what will happen is that these are games where you have a pad or a template sheet that you will write on. Could be writing words, could be joining dots, filling in cubes, filling in shapes, whatever. The games are like limitless when it comes to this mechanic at this point. But the idea is that you will typically either roll dice or draw a card from a deck that will determine what you're allowed to fill in on your sheet. So let's say, for example, you are connecting a railroad network from point A to point B, and you've got to navigate around all sorts of hazards. You roll dice, which has the different directions that you're allowed to go. You can do a right angle, you can do a straight line, you can do a curve, whatever. And so the dice are rolled, and you have to look, oh, that's what I've got available, okay. And so you draw. I'll draw a straight line to there and a right angle to there, get around that mountain. Good. The dice are rolled again, new symbols, you carry on drawing, and then by the end of the game, you see who's got there the fastest, got the most points. That's a very basic example, but if you look up this mechanic on Board Game Geek, it's almost becoming ridiculous as to how many of these games exist. Typically they're small box games, typically they're really cheap, really easy to play, usually involve quite a lot of solitaire play as well, which is where you're typically playing by yourself even though there are other players at the table. Very good examples of roll and writes include Harvest Dice and Silver and Gold. Set collection is where people are trying to gain sets of cards or tiles in order to use them or spend them in some way to gain points or do specific actions. This derives from old card games that you may recognize, like Rummy, for example, where you had to get a set of 3 threes in order to do this and get points, or I need at least 3 queens in order to achieve this goal. I mean, I'm talking very basic examples here, but basically it is collecting a set of something. Doesn't have to be cards, it could be tiles, tokens, as I mentioned. It's just all about getting specific sets that you'll be aware of before the game even starts. 2 highly popular examples of set collection mechanics being used, whether in a big way or a small way, include Ticket to Ride and Jaipur. Simultaneous selection is a very specific mechanic, but it relates to when all players have to pick, say, a card or an action at the same time without revealing it to the other players. At a future point in the game, players will then reveal what card or action they took. The idea being that you yourself, who have picked, say, a card, does not know what the other players have picked, until everybody finds out at the same time. You could be bidding on an item, for example, and you have to play a card with a number from 1 to 9 from your hand to represent how much you're bidding. You may decide to play a 6, but you don't know if other players might decide to play their 7, 8 or 9. So you're having to get into each other's heads to figure that out. Games that can include simultaneous action selection can include Mombasa as well as Raptor. Tile placement is placing tiles on the board. Yeah, I know that sounds like it's stating the obvious, but that's essentially what the mechanic is. Now, the two applications of this typically mean just placing a tile on the board to create a map or a route, for example, but then it could also include putting what are known as polyomino tiles, so think Tetris, crosses, L shapes, all sorts of different shapes of tiles, into a grid or an empty space on your board in order to fill it up most efficiently. Think Tetris, where you had to put the blocks in as efficiently as possible in order to fill up rows. It's the same sort of thing. You're trying to put blocks, say, in a 9x9 grid in such a way that you can fill it up exactly as efficiently as you can. Some very big examples of using this system include Barron Park and Carcassonne. Trick-taking. This is derived from games of old, where you were just playing with a standard deck of cards. There are all sorts of different trick-taking games that you can play with that, but in modern board games, the concept is pretty much the same. Somebody will play a card of a suit, and then other players will have to lead with that suit, and whoever plays the highest card in that suit wins the trick. There may be a trump card, where by playing it you automatically have a suit that's greater than whoever started the trick. It's a very simple concept. It's been used for hundreds of years in card games. It's just now something you tend to find not as often as usual, but you get it in some modern games as well. A very good example of this would be The Crew, The Quest for Planet 9. Worker placement. Ooh, this is the big one. Loads of worker placement games out there, and one of the more popular mechanics that exists. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be workers. It could be a token, a piece, a component you're placing on the board. But the idea of this is that a board may have lots of different spaces or actions that you can go to. So for example, a map of a medieval village, and in that village are different locations you could visit. Visit the blacksmith, visit the horse stables, visit the castle, visit the cathedral, and each space will give you a different action that you can perform. The worker placement aspect of it is that you will place a token or a worker, it's typically a worker, down onto the board at a location in order to trigger that action. But what sets it apart from just simply, randomly putting people on a board is that usually there is a fixed amount of spaces available for players to have. Usually that a location can only be taken by one person. So if I decide I want to visit the cathedral, that means you after me can't visit the cathedral. You have to go somewhere else. So there's a tension within these games as to whether you're going to get blocked out of a particular location. The most common way that worker placement is implemented is the use of meeples. Meeples derived from a game called Carcassonne, and it was essentially a connection of two words, my and people, my people. The term suddenly got combined into meeple, but basically it represents a little wooden figure that is supposed to represent your worker, or your character, or you yourself. By placing that worker on the board, you will get to trigger a specific action. You are going to hear the word meeple used in countless amount of games, so definitely you might want to test yourself on that one at the end of this video. There are loads of examples of worker placement games, but two I'm going to pick for this video are Agricola and Raiders of the North Sea. Engine building games are a harder one to describe, but typically these have you starting off with a fairly basic setup, acquiring small things at the start of the game that will eventually enable you to get bigger and bigger things as the game goes on. You could link this to my earlier description of deck building games. You start off with a basic deck of cards, and then you acquire low cost cards to use in your deck that enable you to buy higher cost cards and therefore eventually buy cards that get you more points. It basically starts you off small and then gradually builds up. It's like building an engine itself. It's like a locomotive. It starts off slow on the track. So it goes off nice and slow and then eventually builds up and builds up speed until eventually it gets to its top speed. The exact same concept can be applied to a board game. It's a little bit of a weird one to describe, but it's used very commonly to describe a lot of Euro games, and therefore it's an important term to know. Two games that involve engine building in some way or another involve Splendor as well as Imperial Settlers. Social deduction games. Now this could be described as a type of game, but I needed to split the category somehow. Social deduction typically involves a lot of players around the table negotiating with each other in real time in order to deduce what role or what purpose another player has in the game. The most common example could be a team versus team game where you don't know who's on what team. So based on the actions of players, you are deciphering where you think people's loyalties lie. Do you think the person sitting next to you is on your team or not? What are their actions telling you? Are they being trustworthy? Are they being a little deceptive? Are they neglecting to tell you pieces of information you want to know? There's a lot of these games around, but essentially it's all about social interaction with players. Some big examples of this include The Resistance as well as Deception Murder in Hong Kong. So that's it for video 2 in this glossary series. Hope so far you've been finding this as a very useful reference aid. The third video is going to cover gamer traits specifically. So you're not going to get board game examples with such a thing, but I will certainly go into enough detail so that when we spout these terms, you will get the idea. Thanks for watching, and if you liked what you see, please subscribe by clicking the avatar in the center of the screen. If you want to check out part 1 of this glossary series, click the link on the left, and if you just want to check out a YouTube recommendation, then check out the other link. Take care, and remember, it's only a game.